The sky over village was unusually gray that morning. A thick layer of clouds hovered above the rice paddies, and a strange heaviness filled the air as if nature itself was bracing for something unspeakable. The villagers, simple and God-fearing people, had lived quiet lives among lush fields and humble wooden homes. But today, the atmosphere had changed. At the end of the village road stood a small house with a pale blue door, the home of Summit, an elderly man who had just passed away the previous evening. His death came without warning. They said he had suffered a heart attack while sitting on the front porch, staring into the sky. It was sudden and silent. But to many, not surprising. Summit had always kept to himself. Though he was never openly cruel, his cold demeanor and refusal to engage in community life had long made him an outlier. He never visited the sick, never attended weddings, and certainly never joined a funeral prayer, not even when his closest neighbors passed away. People spoke of it quietly behind his back, but no one ever dared confront him. Now in death he lay on a wooden plank inside his living room, wrapped tightly in white cloth. His family wept quietly. Neighbors gathered more out of duty than sorrow. But something felt wrong. From the very start of the morning, strange things began to unfold. The first sign was the air, heavier, colder. Several people reported chills, though the weather was mild. One elderly man whispered that he felt like something unseen was watching them. But the most disturbing moment came when 4 men tried to lift the body for ghusl, the ritual washing. It wouldn't move. "It's heavier than it should be," whispered one of the men, his brow furrowed. "I've lifted many bodies in my life. This one, it's like the earth doesn't want to let him go." They tried again. Still no movement. "Maybe we should wait for the imam," said another man. Soon Ustaz Rahmat arrived, a calm and respected figure known for his deep knowledge and gentle manner. Dressed in a white robe and turban, he offered a short prayer before approaching the body. He looked at the family. "Has he had ghusl yet?" The eldest son shook his head. "We couldn't lift him, sir." Ustaz Rahmat frowned slightly, then turned to the others. "Let's try together." With Bismillah. 6 men came forward this time. They surrounded the body and prepared to lift. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. It was as if the body had fused with the floor. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, a sudden gust of wind blew open the windows. Curtains danced violently. An oil lamp nearly fell to the ground. A black crow passed low over the house, its caw echoing ominously. The villagers looked at one another. "That's a bad sign," an old woman whispered from the corner. "Very bad." Ustaz Rahmat gestured for calm. "We will pray," he said gently. "Let us ask Allah for ease." They formed a circle. Men sat with bowed heads. Women remained at the edges of the room, silent, watchful. Prayers filled the air. Surah Yasin. Then Surah Al-Fatiha. Then a dua for forgiveness. Outside, more villagers had gathered. The news was spreading fast. Summit's body can't be moved. "I told you," said a middle-aged woman. "He never once came to my husband's funeral. Not even a dua. Maybe his soul is restless." As the afternoon approached, a group of men tried again to lift the coffin. This time they brought a stretcher, hoping it would help. But the moment they bent down, one of the men gasped and stumbled backward. "I saw something," he said. His face had gone pale. "What did you see?" someone asked. "A black shape, like a shadow moving under the body." People began to murmur. Tension thickened. The family looked helpless. Ustaz Rahmat stood, his voice calm but firm. "There is something unsettled. We need to seek forgiveness, not only from Allah, but from those Summit may have wronged." The villagers were surprised. Was the Imam suggesting that they needed to forgive the dead? "I ask all of you," the Imam continued. "Even if you feel bitterness toward him, please forgive him. Do it for his soul." Do it for your own hearts. There was silence. Then a few heads nodded. Quietly, people began to recite personal du'as. Some closed their eyes. Others whispered names. One by one, the room began to shift from suspicion to prayer. But the unease was far from over. That evening, the wind picked up again. Doors creaked. Shadows danced across the walls. Inside the funeral home, the coffin was still there, untouched, unmoved. Then, without warning, a small child screamed. Everyone turned toward the child who was pointing at the door. It moved, the child said. The coffin moved. People stood frozen. They stared at the coffin. It was tilted slightly. No one had touched it. Step back, Ustaz Rahma said, raising his hand. Something is happening. Then, slowly, the coffin began to shift on its own. It slid forward, inch by inch, toward the doorway. The floor creaked under it. People gasped. No one dared to touch it. The coffin stopped at the threshold. It did not cross. A strong gust blew again, colder than any before. One of the oil lamps flickered and died. In the dimness, someone whispered, "It wants to go, but something is stopping it." Ustaz Rahma stepped forward, reciting verses under his breath. "There is a veil between this world and the next," he said, almost to himself. "And tonight, that veil is thin." Outside, villagers began to gather around the house. Everyone could feel it now. Something unnatural had taken hold. Suddenly, a young man fainted near the doorway. When he awoke, he trembled and said only one sentence. "I heard a voice, it said I will go alone." His words sent a chill through everyone present. The coffin hadn't moved since. That night, no one slept. Night blanketed village in a suffocating silence. The narrow paths that usually echoed with children's laughter and neighbors' greetings were now deserted. Even the dogs didn't bark. All eyes were on the house at the end of the road, the home of the late Pack Summit, where his coffin sat unmoved at the doorway, as if imprisoned between two worlds. Inside, oil lamps flickered weakly. Ustaz Rahmat remained seated cross-legged, reciting soft prayers with an intensity that made his forehead glisten with sweat. Around him, Pack Summit's family clung to each other in silent fear. The once confident sons now looked like helpless boys, unable to make sense of the terrifying events unfolding before them. Suddenly, there was a sound, a faint rustling from outside. Heads turned. The front door creaked ever so slightly. Then, the wind picked up again, howling through the cracks in the wooden walls, as if the house itself were groaning under the weight of something ancient and unseen. "Don't be afraid," Ustaz Rahma said, though his voice was not as steady as before. "Keep praying." Outside, the villagers gathered in small groups, whispering, some holding prayer beads, others simply clutching each other's hands. Fear had found a permanent place in that night. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, all the oil lamps in the house went out, at once. Total darkness. Women gasped. A child began to cry. One of the men outside shouted, "Quick, relight the lamps!" But before anyone could move, a strange bluish light began to glow from the direction of the coffin. It was faint at first, like moonlight caught in mist. But then it grew stronger, illuminating the coffin and casting long, unnatural shadows against the walls. The villagers outside stared in disbelief. "Do you see that?" whispered one young man. No one responded. They all saw it, and they were all too afraid to speak. Inside, Ustaz Rahma stood slowly, turning toward the source of the glow. "This is not ordinary light," he murmured. "This is from the realm of the unseen." Just then, the coffin began to tremble again. Not a strong shake, but a subtle, spine-chilling movement, as if it were breathing. It edged a few inches farther out the door, and stopped again. A woman screamed. The wind returned, stronger now, blowing through the house and lifting dust from the floor. It made the wooden beams groan and the ceiling fan creak, even though no electricity was running. In the yard, an old grandmother stood up from her seat and shouted, "This is because he never paid his respects. The dead don't forget. They've come for him, for justice." Everyone fell silent. In that moment, they understood. Pak Summit, in his lifetime, had denied the rights of the living. Now, in death, he was denied peace by the spirits of the forgotten. Suddenly, the voice of a man, trembling but loud, cut through the tension. "I saw them. I saw them standing around the coffin last night. Eyes red like embers. Black shapes with no face. It was Suradi, a young man who had insisted on guarding the body overnight. Now he stood pale, his lips trembling. They whispered. I don't know what they said. But I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe." A cold hush fell over the crowd. Ustaz Rahmat nodded solemnly. "These are not hallucinations," he said. "These are the consequences of neglect. The pain of the forgotten never truly disappears. It lingers. It remembers." He looked to the sky, now blanketed in heavy clouds. "We must act. If we let fear consume us, this will only grow stronger. We have to take him to the cemetery. He must be buried. No matter what happens." "But how, Ustaz?" asked a man. "The coffin won't move." Before anyone could respond, something impossible happened. The coffin began to float. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mothers shielded their children. Elderly men clutched the ground for support. It was unmistakable. The coffin hovered a few inches above the floor, trembling as it slowly began to move forward, unaided, untouched. It passed through the doorway, turned toward the road, and stopped. "Subhanallah," someone whispered. The bluish glow around it flickered. Ustaz Rahmat raised his hands in prayer. "Ya Allah, guide us. Protect us." But as he began to pray, a low laugh echoed across the yard. It was faint, but it came from the coffin. A woman collapsed to the ground in terror. "That wasn't his voice," she cried. "That wasn't human." No one spoke. Even Ustaz Rahmat's lips stopped moving. They all stood frozen. The laugh faded. But the fear remained, sharper than ever. "Bring the cloths," Ustaz Rahmat finally said. "White ones. Long, wrap them around your hands. We must approach the coffin." A group of men obeyed. Among them was Muliadi, an old farmer with trembling hands but a brave heart. He stepped forward first. As soon as he touched the side of the coffin, he screamed and fell back. "It burns!" he cried. "It's like touching fire!" The villagers backed away. The bluish light grew stronger. Then came the whispers. No clear words. Just a chorus of muffled, layered voices, calling, weeping, chanting names of the dead. People began to recognize the names. Villagers who had passed away over the years. Names that Pak Samit had ignored in life. The past was speaking now, and it wanted justice. An elderly woman, once known as the village healer, stepped beside Ustaz Rahmat. "We must apologize on his behalf," she said. "We must make peace with the forgotten." Ustaz Rahmat nodded. "You are right, Bibi. It's not just about this man. It's about what we let ourselves become as a community." He turned to the crowd. "Let us all come together. Let us speak openly. Let us offer forgiveness, not just for Pak Summit, but for ourselves. Because we too, all of us, have forgotten someone." The villagers bowed their heads. Slowly, the prayers began again, this time with sincerity, humility, and tears. As the collective voice rose into the night, something shifted. The whispers stopped. The wind slowed. And the coffin, still glowing, began to move again. Floating forward. Slowly. Steadily. Toward the village graveyard. The glowing coffin hovered just above the dirt road, as if guided by an invisible hand. A trail of pale blue light followed behind it like a ribbon of mist. The villagers, stunned, wide-eyed, silent, followed in a slow, cautious procession. Some held prayer beads, some whispered verses, and others simply walked, as if pulled by a force they did not understand. Children clung to their mothers. Old men wiped their foreheads, mumbling the names of Allah. No one dared speak too loudly. No one dared question what they were witnessing. It was a moment suspended between two worlds, where the dead seemed to speak, and the living could only obey. The road to the cemetery passed through the heart of village. It had once been filled with morning chatter and the sound of goats or passing bicycles. But now, even the animals were quiet. As the coffin passed each home, dogs whimpered and retreated into corners. Birds fell silent. Leaves trembled, though the air was still. One elderly man whispered, "I've lived here for 70 years. I've never seen anything like this." The coffin made no turns, no hesitations. It followed a perfect path, as if it knew exactly where it needed to go. As they neared the center of the village, the crowd grew. People who had locked themselves indoors earlier had come out, drawn by the light, by the mystery, or perhaps by something deeper, something within their own hearts. Because each of them had once known Pack Summit, and each of them had once ignored someone in pain. In the middle of the village stood a great banyan tree. It had been there for generations, its roots thick like the veins of the earth. Locals considered it sacred, a place where spirits watched and memories lingered. When the coffin reached the tree, it stopped. Without warning, it floated beneath the shadow of the banyan and held still. No one dared move closer. From the crowd, someone whispered, "Is this where he wants to be buried?" "No," Ustaz Rahmat replied, his voice firm but soft. "This is not the graveyard. This is where something is waiting." They waited. The wind began again, gentle at first, then stronger, then wild. Dust spun into the air. Leaves scattered. A child cried. And then, above them, thunder. The sky darkened further, though it was still day. Gray clouds twisted in a spiral, forming a vortex above the banyan tree. People screamed and shielded their eyes. Then, as if torn from another world, a shadow appeared within the swirling sky. A human figure, but not human. Tall. Thin. Cloaked in black smoke. Its eyes glowed red like burning coals. It hovered silently, unmoving, watching the villagers as they trembled. "It's him!" someone gasped. "It's the spirit. The one Surati saw." Some dropped to their knees. Others turned to run. But Ustaz Rahmat raised his hand. "No one runs." He stepped forward. "This test is not just for Pack Summit. It's for all of us. Our fear gave power to what should have never existed." The shadow in the sky did not move. But the light from the coffin grew brighter, now flickering rapidly like a heartbeat. Suddenly, a loud whoosh echoed across the village. The coffin lifted higher, spinning slowly in midair. Blue flames encircled it, not burning, but pulsing with otherworldly energy. "We have to bury him," cried a man. "Or this will never end." Ustaz Rahmat nodded. "Prepare the path to the graveyard. Let him go in peace." But how do you carry a coffin that floats? That's when something miraculous happened. The coffin, still glowing, began to move again on its own, following the dirt path out of the village and toward the cemetery beyond the rice fields. It didn't rush. It didn't delay. It simply floated forward, and the people followed, no longer terrified, but humbled. Children were silent. Women covered their heads. Even the birds returned to their trees and watched from the branches. As the procession reached the old iron gate of the cemetery, a sense of dread returned. Everyone remembered the stories of what had happened at funerals past, but nothing like this. The gate swung open by itself. The coffin entered. It moved through the rows of ancient graves, some cracked and moss-covered, some forgotten by time. And then it stopped, in front of a freshly dug grave that no one had prepared. The grave was already there. "Who dug this?" a man whispered. "No one," another replied. "It was never here before," said a third. The villagers circled the grave in awe. The coffin hovered above it, unmoving. Ustaz Rahmat stepped forward and raised his hands in prayer. "Ya Allah, forgive this soul. If he wronged others, we have forgiven him. If he forgot the rights of the living, we remember them now. If he was lonely, may he find peace in your presence." The people repeated after him. As the final Amin echoed across the graveyard, thunder rolled once more. Then silence. The coffin began to descend. Slowly, slowly, until it gently rested inside the grave. Not a sound came from the ground. No tremor. No whisper. Just stillness. The villagers remained frozen. Then came the final sign. The swirling sky calmed. The red-eyed shadow in the sky faded, dissolving into the air like smoke into wind. And a warm golden ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, touching the earth for the first time in days, falling directly upon the grave. People wept. Not from fear, but from relief. The nightmare was over. Or so they thought. Because in the days that followed, something unexpected began to stir in the heart of village. Days passed since the haunting funeral of Pak Summit, but the villagers did not forget. How could they? They had watched a coffin float, heard voices from nowhere, and seen a dark shadow vanish into the sky. Some tried to return to normal life, to reopen shops, till the rice fields, cook meals without glancing over their shoulders, but fear had left its fingerprints on every heart. Even though the skies had cleared and the winds had stilled, a heavy silence hung over the village. It was not the silence of peace, but of things left unsaid. At night many still heard soft noises, like whispers in the trees or footsteps outside their homes. Children refused to sleep alone. Doors were locked tighter. Lamps stayed lit till dawn. Ustaz Rahmat, ever calm and devout, spent his nights in prayer, pleading for the village's protection. He knew that what they had witnessed was not a simple haunting, it was a reckoning. A punishment not just for one man's coldness, but for a village that had forgotten how to care for its weakest. And in the middle of this quiet storm lived a boy named Joko. Joko was 17, tall, thin, often barefoot. He lived at the edge of the village in a shack made of tin and rotting wood. His father had died in a factory accident when he was 5, and his mother had left not long after. Raised by a mute grandmother, Joko grew up being ignored. Not hated. Just unseen. He was the child no one invited, the boy who sat at the back of every event, the one people spoke over instead of to. And yet, Joko had seen everything. He had been there the night Pak Summit's coffin floated. He had watched the shadow in the sky. And he had felt something different from fear. A pull. A strange, burning feeling inside him, like he was meant to do something more. On the 5th night after the burial, when the village was wrapped in eerie silence, and even the wind dared not howl, Joko sat outside his shack under the full moon. He stared at the path to the cemetery. His heart thudded, slow and deep. Then he heard it. A voice. Not outside. Inside. "Come!" He stood up without hesitation. Barefoot, with only a shawl over his shoulders, he began walking. Past the trees. Past the banyan. Past the houses where people lay sleeping, or pretending to. The path glowed faintly in the moonlight, guiding him forward like a silver thread. When Joko reached the cemetery, he stopped at Pak Summit's grave. It looked different now. Peaceful. The blue light was gone, the grass had grown quickly. But the air was charged, as if the ground still remembered what had been buried there. Joko took a step closer, and the earth beneath his feet shivered. Suddenly, the ground above the grave began to crack, slowly, like ice thawing. Joko gasped but didn't move. His eyes were wide, but not with terror. With wonder. From the crack rose a shadow, not black like before, but made of light and dust. It formed into a tall figure with hollow eyes and no mouth. The figure pointed at him. Joko swallowed hard. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. And then, the figure spoke without speaking. Words entered Joko's mind, not through sound, but sensation. "You saw. You understood. You remembered." "Remembered what?" he asked, heart pounding. "What others forgot, that we all need each other." The figure turned and pointed at the village. "They have learned fear. But not yet love." Then the light began to fade. "No, wait!" Joko cried. "What am I supposed to do?" The figure's final words echoed in his chest. "Remind them. Or the darkness will return." And just like that, it vanished, dissolving into the wind like mist before sunrise. Joko stood alone, trembling. But this time, not in fear. In purpose. He returned home before dawn, his body shivering with fatigue, his mind on fire. The next morning, he did something no one expected. He walked to the village square, barefoot, with dust still on his clothes, and stood in the center. When people passed, he looked them in the eyes. Not with bitterness, not with shame, but with clarity. At first, they ignored him. But he kept returning. Every morning. Every evening. And then, he spoke. He told them what he had seen. Not with drama or threats. Just the truth. Quiet, steady, honest. "I was called," he said. "I was told to remind you that what happened to Pack Summit can happen again. That the shadows are not gone. They are only sleeping. And they wake when we forget each other." Some laughed. Some shook their heads. But some listened. Especially the young. Especially the lonely. Especially the ones who had been ignored, just like Joko. Even Ustaz Ramith noticed. He watched from the mosque window as the boy spoke with fire in his voice and light in his eyes. He approached him one evening. "You've changed," the Imam said softly. "No," Joko replied. "I just finally became who I was supposed to be." The Imam smiled. "Then let me help." Together, they began gathering the youth. They cleaned forgotten graves. They visited the sick. They helped the elderly rebuild their homes. Slowly, inch by inch began to breathe again. But something still lingered. Because even though Pack Summit's grave was calm, the cemetery still felt, watched. And as the villagers healed, something else began to stir, something older than fear, something that wasn't finished yet. And Joko, he could feel it coming. The village was healing, but not healed. In the weeks that followed Pack Summit's supernatural burial, the atmosphere in the village shifted. The streets were no longer entirely silent, and laughter cautiously returned to doorways. People began checking on neighbors they had once ignored. Men who used to rush past the mosque now paused to join the prayer. Women shared meals across property lines, and children who used to play in isolation were now heard in small groups, their voices light and hopeful. But deep down, something still felt unsettled. People said they could hear footsteps at night, not loud, but deliberate. In the silence after midnight, whispers rode the wind. Some villagers swore they saw shadows darting through trees at the edge of the cemetery, vanishing when approached. They said the banyan tree seemed to hum, ever so softly, like it was holding a secret. Joko, meanwhile, had become a quiet leader. Without asking for recognition, he led with presence. People followed him not because he demanded it, but because he represented something they all needed, conviction. Still, Joko could feel it. The presence. The pull. The knowledge that whatever haunted the village was not entirely gone. And then came the dream. One night, Joko awoke drenched in sweat, his body trembling. In the dream, he had stood before Pack Summit's grave again. But this time, the grave was gone, swallowed by a vast pit, endless and black. Inside the pit, Hundreds of glowing red eyes stared up at him. Eyes of souls left unheard. He heard a voice, but it wasn't one he recognized. "You open the door," it said. "Now it cannot be closed without sacrifice." Joko didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, he went straight to Ustaz Ramith, his face pale, his eyes distant. "I think something is still coming," Joko said. The Imam's brow furrowed. "Explain." Joko told him everything: the pit, the voices, the feeling that the earth itself was angry. "It wasn't just about Pak Summit," he finished. "He was the beginning. There are others. Others we forgot. Others who were left alone. Their stories were never told. Their pain never heard." Ustaz Ramith listened in silence. He didn't ask if it was a dream or a vision. He just believed. "Then we must prepare," he said. That evening, the Imam called a gathering in the mosque. For the first time in years, every villager came. The room was packed. Some stood against the walls. Others sat on the floor with children on their laps. Ustaz Ramith spoke first. "My dear brothers and sisters, we have seen with our eyes what happens when hearts are hardened and neighbors are forgotten. But it's not over. We must go deeper. Not just in our prayers, but in our actions." Then Joko stepped forward. He looked so young among them, yet his voice held no hesitation. "There are graves in our cemetery with no names," he said. "There are people in this village whose stories were buried before they died. I feel them calling. And I believe they deserve our respect, our remembrance, and our apology." A murmur spread through the crowd. Then someone stood up. It was an old woman named Bakardi, who had lived alone for decades. Her voice was soft, but her words were strong. "I remember a girl named Sidi," she said. "Died when she was 12. No family claimed her. She's buried behind the well. No one ever visited her grave." A silence followed. Then another man stood. "My grandfather's brother, he disappeared during the war. I think his grave is unmarked. It's near the east wall." One by one, people began to speak. Stories that had never been told. Names that had been erased by time. And with each name, the air in the mosque seemed to shift, grow lighter. As if unseen ears were finally listening. The next day, Joko led a group to the cemetery. They didn't come with fear. They came with brooms, buckets, incense, and flowers. They cleaned every grave, even the cracked ones, the forgotten ones, the nameless ones. They recited prayers at each headstone, and for those without markers, they made one. A small stone. A wooden sign. A single flower. "We remember you," they said aloud. "You were one of us." As the sun set behind the banyan tree, a warmth fell over the cemetery. The wind carried no whispers that night. Only silence. But the peaceful kind. That is, until midnight. At exactly 12 o'clock, Joko awoke again, this time not from a dream, but a sound. It was a low rumble. Like the earth was sighing. Or grieving. He ran outside. So did many others. The sky above the cemetery glowed a faint orange. The banyan tree's limbs moved unnaturally, despite the still air. Then came the scream. High. Echoing. Not human. People gathered at the edges of the cemetery, terrified but unable to turn away. The ground above the east wall, where the unnamed graves were, began to crack. Not from roots. From within. Joko stepped forward. Ustaz Rahmat grabbed his arm. "Wait. I have to," Joko said. "It's me they called." As Joko approached the cracked ground, it split wider, and something rose from it. But it wasn't a body. It was a shape of light and shadow. A figure. It had no face. But its posture radiated sadness and exhaustion. The villagers watched, frozen. The figure raised one arm and pointed toward the village. And a voice, not from the sky, not from the ground, but from their own hearts, spoke. You remembered the forgotten. But one remains. And before anyone could ask what that meant, the figure crumbled into ash and vanished. Joko stood still. One remains? One soul? One grave? Or one truth? A storm of questions formed in his chest. And he knew. This wasn't the end. It was the next door. A heavy hush returned to after the vision in the cemetery. The villagers, already shaken by all they had endured, found themselves asking the same haunting question. Who was the one that remained? Joko couldn't sleep that night. The figure's message echoed in his chest like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. You remembered the forgotten, but one remains. He turned the words over and over in his mind, asking himself who had been missed. The next morning, Joko walked to the mosque before far. The sky was still dark, but a soft glow lingered above the horizon. Ustaz Rahmat was already there, seated quietly on the prayer mat. You felt it too? Joko asked, his voice low. The Imam didn't need to ask what it was. He simply nodded. I believe it wasn't just a name that was forgotten, Ustaz said. It might have been a soul that was never even buried. Joko frowned. What do you mean? Ustaz Rahmat took a breath. There was a time, before your birth, when the village faced a terrible season. Famine. Disease. People died faster than we could bury them. One child, a boy, disappeared. No one ever found his body. His family left shortly after. His name was Araf. Joko repeated it slowly. Araf. The name felt heavy on his tongue. Araf wasn't just forgotten, Ustaz said. He was erased. No funeral. No prayers. No goodbye. Joko stood abruptly. Then we must find him. But we don't know where he is. Then we search, Joko said. We listen. If a spirit has waited this long to be remembered, we can't leave him now. That day, Joko and several young villagers, now loyal to him, began asking the elders about Araf. Many hesitated. The story was old, dusty, buried under years of shame and silence. But little by little, the truth unfolded. Araf was 10 when he vanished. A quiet boy. Observant. Often alone. One day, he had gone to fetch water from the stream beyond the rice fields. He never came back. Some said he slipped and drowned. Others whispered of something darker, an old curse, a forest spirit, a sacrifice made during desperate times. But no one ever went looking for him. No one even prayed for him. Joko's chest burned with grief he didn't fully understand. As if this boy, long dead, was somehow part of him. That evening, Joko walked alone to the stream. The air felt thick. The wind didn't move. Trees stood still, as if they too were waiting. He sat on a rock near the edge of the water, closed his eyes, and whispered, Araf, if you can hear me, I am sorry. We should have come for you. We should have remembered you. The breeze stirred. A chill ran down Joko's spine. Then, he saw it. Just across the stream, between two old trees, stood a figure. Small. Still. The outline of a boy. Joko stood. He didn't speak. He didn't run. He just crossed the water. But when he reached the trees, there was nothing there. Only an old, sunken patch of ground covered in vines and moss. He knelt and touched the earth. And he knew. This is where you are, he whispered. The next morning, Joko returned with shovels, tools, and the village youth. He told them what he'd found, and why it mattered. Not all believed. Some were afraid. But many came anyway. They dug slowly, respectfully, inch by inch. Hours passed. Then, the metal edge of a shovel struck wood. They paused. Cleared the dirt. And there it was. A rotted wooden box, no larger than a child's casket. They lifted it out of the ground. No one spoke. With trembling hands, Joko opened the box. Inside, barely intact, was the skeleton of a child, wrapped in pieces of faded cloth. Beside it, a small wooden toy, a carved bird. Someone gasped. Someone else began to cry. "Araf," Joko murmured. "We found you." Ustaz Rahmat led the janazah prayer that evening. For the first time in decades, the entire village gathered in the cemetery, not for a funeral driven by fear, but one guided by atonement. They buried Araf beneath the banyan tree, near the others they had remembered before. A new grave. A new headstone. A name finally spoken. Araf bin Hilmi. Age 10. Returned to us. After the final dua, the wind picked up gently, brushing across the crowd. Not cold. Not angry. Just present. That night, the sky above was full of stars. And for the first time in weeks, no one heard whispers. No one saw shadows. No one dreamed of red eyes. Peace, real, complete peace, had settled over the village. But as Joko stood beside Araf's grave, he realized something. "This was never just about the dead," he said aloud. "It was about us." Because the truth was, they had been the ones haunted, not by ghosts, but by guilt, neglect, and silence. The spirits had simply held up a mirror. And now, at last, they could begin again. Weeks passed. The grave of Araf, once hidden and smothered by time, now stood at the heart of the cemetery, not grand, but dignified. Each day, someone came to visit. A flower was always placed. Children began to speak his name freely, and elders who once avoided the story now shared it as a reminder. Something had changed. Not just in the wind, or the way the banyan tree no longer groaned at night. Not even in the cemetery, where no more shadows crept between gravestones. The change was in the people. Where there had been fear, there was now warmth. Where there had been silence, there was now reflection. Where there had been forgotten souls, there was now memory and prayer. Joko no longer walked alone. Children followed him with questions. Mothers called out to him to share meals. The men who once dismissed him now asked for his help organizing village events. His once isolated shack had been replaced by a small, solid home near the mosque, built with the help of villagers who now considered him a brother. And Joko? He had changed too. The boy who had once stared at the ground now looked people in the eyes. Not with arrogance, but with quiet certainty. He had touched the unseen, not just ghosts, but truths buried in people's hearts. And he had come back from that darkness with something rare. Clarity. One evening, under a pale orange sky, Ustaz Rahmat invited Joko to the mosque after Maghrib. The village was quieter than usual, the kind of peace that comes not from silence, but from hearts at rest. Inside, the mosque was dimly lit. The smell of clean mats and oil lamps filled the air. The imam gestured for Joko to sit. "I am growing old," Ustaz Rahmat said gently. "You are growing wise," Joko replied with a smile. The imam chuckled. "Maybe. Or maybe I've just lived long enough to know when to step aside." Joko's expression shifted. "You're not leaving? I'll still be here. But I won't lead the village alone anymore. It needs someone younger. Someone who's walked through fire and come back holding light." Joko's heart pounded. "You mean me?" "I do," the imam said. "You reminded us who we are. You reminded me what it means to serve, not just preach." Joko sat in silence for a long moment. Then he nodded, not out of pride, but out of acceptance. Later that night, he returned to Araf's grave alone. The air was still. The stars above shimmered like tiny prayers hung in the sky. Joko sat cross-legged and whispered, "We didn't just bury you, Araf. We raised something, too. We raised a village that remembers. That sees. that listens. As he spoke, a soft breeze brushed across the field. No voices. No shadows. Just peace. And in that stillness, Joko felt it, a presence, not near him, but within him. Not a Raf. Not Summit. But something older than both. Responsibility. The kind that doesn't end with one good deed. The kind that follows you, that you choose to carry because it means something. From that day on, was never the same. People visited graves not only to mourn, but to honor. The mosque became more than a place of prayer, it became a home for the lonely, the lost, and the overlooked. Stories were no longer buried with the dead. They were passed on, told with reverence. Even the banyan tree changed. Its roots, once tangled in pain, now offered shade to children learning Qur'an beneath it. Its branches, once creaking with spiritual weight, now swayed peacefully in the wind. And every year, on the anniversary of Araf's burial, the villagers gathered for a night of remembrance. Not just for him, but for every name they had once forgotten. Joko would stand at the front, now in a simple robe, with a voice steady and clear, and say, "Every soul deserves dignity. Every story deserves to be told. And no one should ever be buried in silence." And they would all respond, with one voice, "Ameen." Because then they had learned something the hard way. It is not death that haunts the living. It is neglect. It is apathy. It is silence when a voice should be raised. And once they broke that silence, once they remembered what it meant to be a community, the spirits of the dead, and the burdens of the living, could finally rest. In peace. Forever. Peace be upon you, and Allah's mercy and blessings. This is not a fictional story. It's a moment that shook an entire church and left hundreds of people questioning everything they had believed about Islam. A nun stood on the altar, her hands trembling not from fear but from rage, and with that rage she tore into the Qur'an, page by page. She thought she was silencing the truth. But then, a 17-year-old Muslim boy stood up. Not with anger. Not with hate. But with calmness, wisdom, and conviction. And what followed, no one in that church could ever forget. That day, in a towering church at the heart of downtown Chicago, the usual peace that filled its stained glass halls was replaced with a strange, restless energy. The sun filtered softly through the windows, painting the polished wooden floor with splashes of color. Families had come as they always did, mothers holding toddlers, elderly men gripping their canes, couples dressed in Sunday formals. The atmosphere was filled with quiet whispers, the rustle of coats, and the occasional shuffling of hymn books. But there was tension too. A whisper of something not quite right. On the raised altar, where warm sermons and blessings were usually shared, stood Sister Clara, a towering figure, both in presence and reputation. Known for her eloquence and leadership, Clara had spent decades within the church walls, guiding others, counseling the young, comforting the grieving. But today, her expression was different. Gone was the gentle smile. In its place, a grim resolve. Clara raised her voice. Her tone, once gentle and wise, now cracked with bitterness. "Islam," she declared, "is not a religion of peace. It is a religion of deception." Her voice echoed across the stone walls, sharp enough to silence the murmurs. "The book they follow, the Qur'an, is filled with contradictions, false promises, and dangerous ideas." Some in the congregation shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others looked to her with wide eyes, caught between shock and loyalty. It was rare to hear such direct condemnation in this holy place. Clara did not stop. She held up the Qur'an in her left hand, her fingers tight around its cover. "This book claims to be from God. But I will show you what it truly is, a man-made collection of confused thoughts and oppressive rules." With a dramatic pause, she turned a few pages, quoted verses without context, and laughed bitterly after each one. "Polygamy? Holy war? Suppression of women? And you call this holy?" Her voice grew louder, her pace faster. "This isn't divine. This is dangerous." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. Some nodded. Others looked away, visibly disturbed. Then Clara did something no one expected. She raised the Qur'an high above her head and tore out a page. The sound of tearing echoed through the microphone. Another page followed. Then another. Until torn fragments fell like ash at her feet. A wave of clapping rose from a few corners of the room. But most sat frozen. Conflicted. Unsure whether to cheer or cry. Outside, a boy was walking past the church gates. His name was Arif. He was 17. A thin, quiet student returning home from the city library, his backpack heavy with books, philosophy, comparative religion, world history. He walked with his eyes low, mind deep in thought. But then, a voice cut through the air. Loud. Angry. Hostile. His ears perked up. He slowed his steps. Turned his head toward the church doors. And listened. "A book full of lies," the voice shouted. Arif's heart skipped. Another voice. "Tear it. Tear the falsehood apart." He stopped completely. The words were too sharp to ignore. He turned fully and looked at the tall wooden doors of the church, slightly ajar. Without a second thought, Arif walked toward them. Inside, Clara was still on the altar, her hands now resting beside the torn Qur'an, her chest rising and falling as the adrenaline pumped through her. Around her, the room was in mixed silence and murmurs. Then the doors opened wider. A young man stepped in. Alone. Quiet. Every head turned toward him. A Muslim? Here? Clara narrowed her eyes at the boy's simple clothes, his modest appearance, the calm in his eyes. She scoffed, almost amused. "You," she said with a cold smile. "You came to defend your book?" Arif looked around. Hundreds of eyes stared back at him, some filled with anger, others confusion, some curiosity. He stepped forward slowly. Stopped near the front row. Bowed his head gently, showing respect. Then he raised his gaze and said, in a clear and steady voice, "I did not come to fight, sister. I came to clarify what you misunderstood." A stunned silence followed. Clara straightened her back. "You want to speak here?" she asked. "This is a church. Not a courtroom." "I understand," Arif replied. "But truth does not belong to one building. It belongs to whoever seeks it." The congregation fell silent again. Even those who had clapped earlier now leaned forward. Something about the boy's voice, its calmness, its courage, made them curious. Clara folded her arms, nodding sharply. "Very well. Say what you came to say. But be warned, I've read your book. I've studied your religion. And I know its darkness." Arif took a breath. And then he began. "Sister Clara, you claim that the Qur'an is full of contradictions. That it misleads people. But may I ask, have you studied it with an open heart?" Clara didn't answer. She only stared, waiting. "You quoted verses out of context," Arif continued. "Verses that appear strange if pulled alone. But any book, even the Bible, when sliced into fragments, can be made to sound confusing." He turned to the congregation. "Have you ever asked why over 1 billion people follow Islam? Do you think all of them are deceived? Or could it be that we, as humans, often judge before we understand?" No one moved. "Sister, you tore pages of a book you don't believe in. But tearing paper doesn't erase truth. It doesn't shake the hearts of those who have read those words with sincerity." Clara clenched her jaw. Arif's voice softened. "I invite you not to attack what you don't understand, but to ask, to listen. And if you find even one truth in what I say, just one, then maybe that truth deserves your time." The church was quiet. Even the air felt still. And Arif knew this was just the beginning. Clara's eyes narrowed. The calm confidence in Arif's voice unsettled her. She had expected anger, maybe even protest. But not this, not a young Muslim speaking with such poise, not in her church, not in front of her congregation. Still, she wasn't ready to back down. "You speak well, boy," she said, her voice sharp like glass. "But clever words don't change facts. I've studied your Qur'an. And I'll repeat it clearly, it contradicts itself. It says one thing in one verse, and another in the next. That is not divine. That's confusion." Some members of the congregation nodded slowly, encouraged by Clara's firmness. Others looked uncertain. The room was on edge, suspended between defiance and doubt. Arif remained steady. "Then allow me to respond, Sister Clara," he said, turning to address the church once more. "You claim the Quran contradicts itself, that it speaks in confusion. May I ask, can you give one example?" Clara looked almost offended. "One example? There are dozens. But fine. Here's one. In one verse your book says there's no compulsion in religion. But in another, it tells Muslims to fight disbelievers. Isn't that a contradiction?" The room murmured. This was a common objection, and Clara delivered it with force. She folded her arms again, as if to say, "Checkmate." Arif nodded slowly, showing neither panic nor hesitation. "That's a valid question," he replied. "But only if we ignore the context." He turned his body slightly so more of the congregation could see his face clearly. "Sister, the Quran was revealed over 23 years. Its verses responded to different events, different challenges, different enemies. Some verses were revealed in times of peace. Others during times of war." He walked a step forward. "The verse that says there is no compulsion in religion, that is from Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 256. And it is universal. Permanent. It means we cannot force someone to become Muslim. Faith must come from the heart, not the sword." He paused. "The verses that mention fighting, those came at a time when Muslims were being killed, tortured, and expelled from their homes simply for believing in one God. Those verses gave permission to defend themselves, not to attack the innocent." Clara raised a brow. "So you're saying your religion is peaceful?" "I'm saying it commands justice," Arif replied gently. "And justice includes the right to self-defense, but with limits. The Quran forbids killing children. It forbids harming those who aren't fighting you. It forbids destroying trees, homes, places of worship." He took another breath. "Tell me, Sister Clara, is that not more merciful than what we see in most wars today?" Silence. The congregation was quiet again. People looked at each other, some thoughtful, others uncomfortable. The truths they were hearing challenged old assumptions. Clara wasn't finished. "Even if that's true," she said, her voice quieter now, "your Quran is still full of verses that are unclear. Why doesn't it speak plainly? Why does it feel poetic and hard to understand? If God wanted to guide us, why not write simply?" Arif smiled slightly, not with mockery, but with compassion. "That's a beautiful question," he said. "And I want you to imagine something with me." He looked at the crowd again. "Imagine you're speaking to every generation in every land, from the deserts of Arabia to the skyscrapers of New York, from the uneducated shepherd to the professor of science. Would you use only one kind of language?" Clara didn't reply. "The Quran speaks in layers," Arif continued. "Its beauty is that it touches the heart of a child and the intellect of a scholar. Its verses are simple for the pure-hearted, and deep for those who reflect. And that's why millions study it for a lifetime, and still discover something new every day." The church remained still. A man in the second row leaned forward slightly, hands clasped. A young woman in the back frowned, but not with anger, with curiosity. Clara's posture loosened slightly. She had delivered her strongest point, but the boy had answered with thoughtfulness. Still, One more question burned in her mind. If it's such a perfect book, she asked, then why so many interpretations? Why do even Muslims disagree? Arif nodded slowly. Because humans have different minds, different languages, different histories. The Qur'an is perfect. We are not. He looked directly at Clara. But even with all those differences, Muslims around the world still agree on the core message: one God, one prophet, one book, one judgment day, and the call to righteousness, prayer, charity, and justice. He paused. Sister Clara, you said earlier that this book was full of lies. But I challenge you not to tear it again, but to read it. With the same energy you used to condemn it. Read it like someone searching, not like someone attacking. Clara's lips parted slightly, as if caught between response and silence. Arif's words carried a weight, not just of knowledge, but of sincerity. A man in the third row whispered to his wife, "Have you ever read it?" She shook her head, eyes still fixed on Arif. An old man sitting beside the aisle wiped his glasses and blinked, as if trying to see more clearly. The church, once echoing with Clara's bold claims, now felt like a place of listening. Arif gently reached into his bag and held up his own small copy of the Qur'an. This book, he said, was not written by a man. It was revealed, piece by piece, verse by verse, over 2 decades, preserved without change, memorized by children as young as 6, and it has guided hearts for over 1,400 years. He placed the Qur'an respectfully on the nearby podium, letting its presence speak for itself. I'm not asking you to convert, he said softly. I'm asking you to be fair. Clara looked at the boy in silence. She hadn't expected this. She expected rage, or blind loyalty, or silence. Instead, she got wisdom, calm, and truth that she couldn't dismiss so easily. One woman in the front row, clutching a gold cross around her neck, looked down at the pages Clara had torn earlier, still scattered like feathers at her feet. A deep discomfort filled her chest. She whispered, "Why do I feel guilty?" Arif stepped back. "I said what I came to say," he concluded. "The rest is between your heart and the truth." And with that, he stood still, letting the silence carry what words could no longer express. Clara stepped away from the altar for a moment. Her breathing had changed. Slower. Uneven. Her eyes scanned the room and then rested again on the boy who had disrupted her certainty. Her voice, though quieter now, carried a deeper sharpness, the kind born not just from defiance, but from desperation. "You say your Qur'an is without contradiction," she said coldly. "Then explain this polygamy. Your religion allows men to marry multiple women. Is that justice? Is that compassion? Is that what you call equality?" A few gasps rose in the room. Some members of the congregation nodded again, encouraged by Clara's renewed attack. Arif didn't flinch. He turned slightly toward the crowd, as if answering not just Clara, but everyone watching. "I understand why you ask this," he said gently. "Polygamy sounds strange to many. But let me explain what the Qur'an actually says, not what people assume it says." He paused for a breath. Yes, the Qur'an allows a man to marry more than one wife, up to 4. But with one condition. He held up his index finger. Only if he can be completely fair to all of them. Emotionally. Financially. In time. In love. He let that linger for a moment. And right after giving that permission, Allah says clearly, if you fear you cannot be just, then marry only one. He glanced at Clara. It's in Surah An-Nisa, verse 3. The crowd was listening closely now. Islam does not command polygamy, Arif continued. It only permits it in limited, difficult situations. During the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, many men died in battle, leaving behind widows and orphans. What would society do? Abandon them? Let women suffer alone in poverty? Or offer protection through marriage? He walked a step forward. Polygamy was never about pleasure. It was about responsibility. Islam didn't invent it, it existed long before. What Islam did was regulate it, limit it, make it just. Clara pressed her lips tightly. So you're saying that's mercy? Arif nodded calmly. Yes. Mercy doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes, what seems strange in one culture is survival in another. A man in the fourth row, who had been sitting with his arms crossed since the beginning, now looked slightly less rigid. His expression softened as he murmured, I never thought of it that way. Clara wasn't done. She took a step forward again, her voice rising, her tone sharper. Fine. Let's say that's justified. Then answer this, Arif. What about jihad? Isn't that your religion's word for holy war? Isn't jihad the reason people fly planes into buildings? The reason the world fears Islam? The room tensed. The very mention of the word, jihad, cast a dark shadow over the space. Everyone was silent again, waiting to see what this boy would say now. Arif didn't rush his response. He let the silence breathe for a moment. Then he asked gently, Do you really want to know what jihad means, sister? Or just what the media told you it means? Clara frowned but didn't respond. Arif turned once more to the congregation. Let me be clear, he began. Jihad does not mean holy war. That's a mistranslation. That's propaganda. A woman in the front row leaned in, eyes wide. Jihad, Arif explained, means struggle. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said the greatest jihad is the struggle within yourself, to control your ego, your anger, your greed. To fight your own darkness. He took another step, his voice gaining strength. Yes, there is also jihad of defense, to protect your home, your land, your people. But Islam places strict rules on that. No killing of children. No harming women. No destroying trees. No killing non-combatants. And never fight first. Always respond only if attacked. He looked around the room, slowly. Which other system of war ethics in the world is that clear? That strict? That moral? Clara clenched her fist slightly, but said nothing. And let me ask you, Arif continued, his tone softer again. What do we call it when soldiers defend their homeland here in America? Patriotism? Duty? But when Muslims defend themselves, it's terrorism. The silence deepened. He nodded. If a Muslim kills the innocent, that's murder. It's haram. It's a sin. And no verse in the Qur'an permits it. He reached into his bag again and opened a bookmarked page. The Qur'an says, whoever kills a person, it is as if he has killed all of mankind. That's from Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 32. Now even Clara's face had changed. The smug certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to confusion. An old woman in the middle row wiped her eyes. No one knew if it was from emotion or embarrassment. Arif placed the open Qur'an gently on the podium again. Sister, he said softly, I know why you hate jihad. Because the word was twisted, abused, exploited by extremists and criminals. But would you hate Christianity because of the Crusades? Because of what some priests did to children? Clara blinked. That one hit deep. Arif lowered his eyes humbly. Every faith has people who misuse it. But don't judge the religion by its worst followers. Judge it by its book, by its prophet, by its message. He stepped back, giving space for his words to settle. Clara was breathing heavily now. Not out of anger, but because something inside her was cracking. Her walls were weakening. The congregation had changed too. There were no more whispered jokes. No smirks. Just silence. Eyes wide open. Hearts stunned. A boy of 17 had just dismantled the two biggest accusations thrown at his faith, and not once did he raise his voice. Not once did he insult. Not once did he defend with hate. He only used truth. The old man sitting near the aisle looked at Clara, then at Arif, then back at Clara. And for the first time in decades, he wasn't sure who was preaching the truth anymore. Clara's hands trembled slightly now. She had tried to strike at the core, first by accusing the Qur'an of contradictions, then by framing polygamy and jihad as injustices. But the boy's answers weren't just calm, they were clear, measured, unshakable. Each of his words had sliced through her assumptions like light breaking through fog. She looked at him, still defiant, but no longer proud. "You speak as if your religion is perfect," she said, her voice lower than before. "But tell me something, Arif. What about all these so-called miracles in Islam? Splitting of the moon? Talking ants? The night journey? Isn't it all just fairy tales for the simple-minded?" Some of the congregation stirred uneasily. One man even chuckled under his breath. The room felt tense again. Arif looked at Clara, not with offense, but with sympathy. "Sister," he said gently, "every religion has miracles. Stories that seem impossible. Moses parted the sea. Jesus walked on water. Why are the miracles of Islam less believable than those?" Clara frowned but said nothing. "But let's take your question seriously," Arif continued. "You mentioned the splitting of the moon. That miracle is recorded in Islamic tradition, and there are also historical accounts from distant civilizations that describe a strange celestial event around the same time. But even if we set that aside, let me show you something even greater." He took a small breath and opened his Qur'an again, flipping to a marked page. "You asked about miracles. I want to talk about something you didn't expect, science." Now the room leaned in. Arif held the Qur'an up slightly, respectfully. "This book," he said, "was revealed more than 1,400 years ago. To a man who could neither read nor write. In a desert. At a time when people thought the sun revolved around the earth." He turned to Clara. "So how could he know things that modern science would only discover centuries later?" Clara crossed her arms. "Such as?" Arif didn't flinch. "Surah Al-Anbiya verse 30, do not the disbelievers see that the heavens and the earth were joined together, then we split them apart?" He looked around. "That sounds very close to the Big Bang Theory, doesn't it?" A murmur spread through the church. "And in Surah Al-Mu'minin, verse 13 to 14, Arif continued, the Quran describes the stages of human embryonic development, in exact sequence, from a sperm drop, to a clinging clot, to a lump of flesh, then bones, and finally flesh covering the bones." He paused. "Microscopes didn't exist in the 7th century. Embryology wasn't even a science. So how could a man living in the desert describe that so accurately?" Clara was quiet now. Her expression had changed again, the eyebrows less arched, the jaw less tense. Something in her eyes betrayed what she didn't want to say out loud. Confusion. Arif's tone remained respectful but firm. "You said the Quran contradicts science. But I say, it anticipated it." He turned a page. "Surah Ar-Rahman describes the barrier between two bodies of water, one fresh, one salty, that meet but don't mix. Modern oceanography confirms this. We now call it the picnic line, a layer of separation due to differences in salinity, temperature, and density. But the Quran mentioned it 14 centuries ago." The old man in the back row sat up straighter. The young woman beside him leaned to whisper something, but her eyes never left Arif. Arif stepped closer, placing the Quran down again. "This book isn't a science textbook," he said. "But it has verses that challenge our understanding of the world, verses that led even non-Muslim scientists to admit this couldn't have come from a human mind." Clara looked down, then back at him. "Or maybe you're just interpreting it that way. Maybe those verses are vague, and you're twisting them to fit modern ideas. Arif nodded. That's a fair point, sister. People can twist verses. Muslims do it too. That's why we rely not just on the words, but on context, cross-references, language, and consistency. He leaned slightly forward, not threatening, but as if inviting her to come closer to the truth. I'm not asking you to believe blindly. I'm asking you to ask yourself, how could an unlettered man, with no access to microscopes or telescopes, speak of such things with such precision? Clara's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Arif smiled softly. If a man writes a book of poetry, we call him a poet. If he writes a book on war, we call him a general. If he writes about astronomy, medicine, ethics, law, and the soul, in perfect harmony, then what do we call him? A silence fell over the church again. One woman in the middle row covered her mouth. Another clutched the Bible in her lap, as if holding on to something slipping away. Arif looked at Clara once more. Miracles don't always mean walking on water. Sometimes the miracle is a book, untouched, unchanged, unmatched, that stands for 14 centuries and still speaks to every heart that truly listens. A few people lowered their heads. Not out of shame, but reflection. Even Clara now seemed smaller behind the altar. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her thoughts were louder than her voice. She had come to lead a charge, but now, the ground beneath her was shifting. She finally managed to ask, So you believe this book has all the answers? Arif shook his head. No. I believe it has all the questions we need to ask, and the guidance to find the answers. But only if we're honest with ourselves. Then, with a voice full of sincerity, he added, You tore pages from the Qur'an. But what truly matters isn't what your hands tear, it's what your heart refuses to open. Clara stood frozen. And in the silence that followed, something in the church shifted. For the first time, the people weren't looking at Clara for guidance. They were looking at Arif. Clara stood quietly behind the pulpit, her hands gripping its edges. She had hurled her sharpest accusations, contradiction, polygamy, jihad, and miracles. And yet the boy in front of her remained composed, each response slicing through her certainty like a slow, deliberate wind. Her voice, once a weapon, now sounded uncertain, hollow. But then, as if finding strength in one final strike, she looked up with a spark of old fire in her eyes. All right, she said. Let's talk about your laws. Arif met her gaze, respectful as ever. Clara's voice was steady again, but colder now. Islam teaches the cutting of hands for theft. Flogging for adultery. These are not punishments, they are barbarity. How can a religion that claims mercy also promote cruelty? The congregation stiffened. This was it, the most sensitive, the most controversial accusation. Even those who had been moved by Arif's earlier words now tensed. This topic had been whispered about for years, sometimes with confusion, sometimes with horror. Arif stayed silent for a moment, letting the gravity of the question hang in the air. Then he nodded. Sister Clara, he said softly, you've asked a very important question. And I'm grateful you did, because many people wonder the same, but are too afraid to ask it. He stepped forward slowly, his hands calm by his sides. But before we talk about the punishments, he continued, let's talk about justice. He turned to the crowd. What is justice? Is it letting people steal freely? Is it letting rapists walk free because they have a good lawyer? Or is it about protecting the innocent, the weak, the victims? Clara folded her arms tightly, watching. Islamic law, known as Sharia, isn't designed for vengeance, Arif explained. It's designed to protect, to prevent, to deter. And its punishments are not meant to be easy, because crime is not easy for the victim. He walked toward the front pews now. The Qur'an commands the cutting of a thief's hand in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 38. But do you know how many conditions must be met before that is even considered? A man in the back muttered. What conditions? Arif looked up. First, the theft must be deliberate, not hunger, not desperation. Second, the stolen item must be of significant value. Third, there must be no doubt. Fourth, the society must already be just, where every citizen has access to food, work, safety. Only then can justice be applied. He paused. And even then, forgiveness is always better. Clara narrowed her eyes. But still, cutting someone's hand? Arif didn't flinch. It sounds harsh, he admitted. But how many people today steal without fear? Corporations, banks, politicians. How many children suffer because someone richer thought they'd never be caught? He took a breath. The goal is not to hurt. The goal is to stop the hurting. The room was quiet again. You want to talk about flogging? He asked, turning toward Clara gently. Islam commands that too, for public immorality, not for private sin. But even then, do you know how many witnesses are required to make it valid? He raised 4 fingers. 4. 4 people must witness the act clearly. If even one is missing, the punishment cannot be carried out. And if someone falsely accuses, they themselves are punished. A woman in the 3rd row leaned back, visibly shaken. She whispered, That's stricter than what I thought. Arif nodded. These laws weren't created for chaos. They were designed to build order, stability, safety. Imagine living in a society where you never lock your door at night, where a widow walks safely at midnight, where no one cheats you because they fear God more than the law. Clara's eyes softened. But isn't that fear? Isn't that forcing people to behave through punishment? Arif's voice lowered now, tender, reflective. No. It's reminding people that actions have consequences. And the goal isn't punishment, it's prevention. That's why in Islamic history these punishments were rarely applied. Not because they were hidden, but because the system worked, people were fed, helped, educated, supported. He looked around the church. Which is more cruel, a punishment that prevents 1,000 crimes, or a freedom that allows evil to flourish? Silence. He stepped back toward the pulpit again. And even then, he added, Islam always opens the door to mercy, forgiveness, repentance. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, once stopped a punishment because the accused repented sincerely. He said, avoid applying punishments whenever you can. If there's a doubt, let it go. It's better to err in mercy than in severity. Tears were forming in a woman's eyes near the center aisle. An elderly man near the back sighed heavily, as if burdened by everything he had just learned. Clara looked down. This was not the debate she had prepared for. She thought she would expose a religion. But instead, she had seen it revealed, not by argument, but by truth. Not by force, but by patience. And now, even her final weapon, the charge of cruelty, had dissolved in front of her, replaced by something she hadn't expected. Wisdom. Arif stood still, his hands folded gently in front of him. I don't ask you to agree with everything, he said quietly. I only asked you to look again, not with anger, but with fairness. He took a long pause, his eyes scanning the room. The Qur'an says, we sent you not, O Muhammad, except as a mercy to all the worlds. That's what Islam is. A mercy. But mercy begins only when the heart is willing to listen. Clara said nothing. She could feel something inside her starting to unravel, not her pride, but her walls. All the ideas she had believed, all the claims she had made, all the confidence she had stood on, now shook beneath her. The congregation, too, was no longer on her side. They weren't clapping. They weren't nodding. They were thinking, reflecting, and slowly opening. The air inside the church had changed. It was no longer filled with the echo of Clara's bold voice or the rhythm of applause. Instead, there was a strange, weighty stillness, like the final seconds before a storm breaks or a soul begins to surrender. Every eye that once looked to Clara with admiration now turned toward her with quiet confusion. Not hatred. Not ridicule. Just questioning. Clara gripped the sides of the pulpit as if it were the only thing holding her up. She opened her mouth, perhaps to argue one last time, to salvage what pride remained. But no words came. Her throat tightened, and something unexpected pressed against her chest. Was it doubt? Fear? Or something far deeper, a truth she had locked out for too long? Arif stood quietly, not speaking. He knew the silence was now louder than anything he could say. He had seen this before, not here, not with a nun in a church, but in the eyes of people who'd built their lives on falsehoods without realizing it. Until one moment breaks them. And that moment was now. Clara finally spoke, her voice hoarse. Is what you said really in your book? Arif nodded gently. Every word. She lowered her gaze, unable to look him in the eyes. And all this time, I was taught the opposite. From the pews, a quiet murmur rippled like a soft wind. The congregation was shifting, spiritually, mentally, emotionally. No one dared to stand. No one dared to applaud or challenge. The battle had ended, but no one had won. Because the truth wasn't about victory. It was about surrendering to something greater. In the back row, an old man who had earlier cheered Clara's words now leaned forward. He held his head in his hands, whispering to the man beside him. What if we've misunderstood everything? The man beside him didn't answer. He just stared straight ahead, pale and silent. A young woman sitting in the front clutched the cross around her neck. Not tightly, but thoughtfully. Her eyes were glossy. Her thoughts were racing. Why have I never heard any of this before? She whispered to herself. Clara was still frozen behind the pulpit. Her hands, once raised in anger, now trembled beside her. Her voice returned in a fragile whisper. So many years, I stood here, telling people that Islam was a lie, that the Qur'an was violent, that Muslims were misled. She looked around the hall, then back at Arif. Her lips quivered. But you didn't come here to insult me. You didn't shout. You didn't even defend with anger. You just answered. Arif's voice was low and calm. Because truth doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be clear. Clara took a step back from the pulpit, then stumbled slightly. A few people in the front row rose instinctively, unsure whether to help her or simply stand with her. She held out a hand, not to push anyone away, but to steady herself. I don't know what I believe anymore, she admitted, her voice cracking. All I know is something inside me is breaking. Tears welled in her eyes. She tried to blink them away, but they fell anyway. And with those tears, the entire church saw something they had never seen before. Not a nun. Not a leader. But a human being, stripped of certainty. Arif stepped forward slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move in triumph. He simply stood a few feet away and said, Sister Clara, the Qur'an is not here to humiliate you. It's here to heal. She looked at him, broken. And after all I've said? After what I did? He shook his head. Allah is more merciful than any of us can understand. No matter what we've done, as long as the heart turns sincerely, the door of truth never closes. The congregation was silent. Some wept quietly. Others sat stunned, unable to believe what they were witnessing. A man rose slowly from the third row. He was tall, in his late 60s, with silver hair and sunken eyes. His voice trembled as he spoke. I came here today to hear my sister preach. But instead, I heard a stranger speak truths I never knew. He looked at Arif. I want to read that book, he said firmly. The one you spoke from. Another woman stood up. Me too. Then another. And another. In a matter of moments, dozens of hands were raised across the church. People were no longer interested in debate. They wanted to know. They wanted to read. They wanted to understand the book they had feared. Clara watched all of it in silence. Her heart swelled with emotions she couldn't name. Regret. Relief. Guilt. Curiosity. Hope. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know where to start." Arif reached into his bag once again. He pulled out a small, worn copy of the Qur'an. Its pages had been read many times. Its corners softened by prayer. He stepped forward and held it out to her with both hands. Clara looked at the book for a long time. Her fingers trembled as she reached out. When she touched it, something inside her shifted. Something heavy lifted. Something deeper awakened. She accepted the book. "I promise," she whispered, "I'll read it. Not with anger. Not with fear. Just with an open heart." Arif smiled, not with pride, but with peace. "That's all truth ever asks," he replied. In that moment, the grand church, once filled with tension and accusation, became something else entirely. A place of stillness. Of questions. Of beginnings. The church had never felt like this before. It was no longer a hall of judgment, no longer a courtroom of dogmas. It had become a space of pause, a breath before a new beginning. The once defiant stained glass windows no longer glared down in silence. Now they bathed the room in gentle, shifting color. And in the middle of it all stood Clara, a nun once furious, now broken open, and holding a Qur'an in both hands like it was a newborn truth. She didn't speak. She couldn't. The pages she had once torn in fury were now in her hands again, this time whole. Sacred. Intact. Her tears weren't loud. They fell silently, like raindrops in an empty hall, but every soul there could feel the weight behind them. The congregation sat still, eyes fixed not on Arif now, but on Clara. And that, more than any debate, more than any verse, more than any argument, that was what moved them. That this woman, who had once stood tall above them as a leader, had now bowed her head, not in shame, but in surrender. Not to a person, but to something her heart had just begun to see. Arif said nothing more. He stood silently near the steps of the altar, his head slightly bowed in quiet respect. There was no need for victory. No need for applause. He had not come to win a war. He had come to let the truth speak for itself. And it had. One by one, members of the congregation began to stand. Some stepped forward, some whispered prayers they didn't yet understand, and others simply wept, not for loss, but for what they had just found. An old woman in the third pew held her granddaughter's hand and whispered, "I never knew Islam could be this gentle." A teenage boy leaned into his father's side. "He's younger than me," he whispered about Arif. "But he spoke like a scholar." A middle-aged man approached Arif with trembling hands. Can I get one too?" he asked, nodding toward the Qur'an in Clara's hands. Arif reached into his bag again. "Of course," he said softly. Then another asked. And another. Within minutes, every extra copy Arif had was gone, passed from hand to hand like torches lighting a dark corridor. But still, Clara said nothing. She stared at the Arabic words on the open page in front of her, not understanding them with her eyes, but feeling them settle deep into a place she hadn't visited in years, her soul. And then, finally, her voice returned. Fragile. Whispered. "Arif," she said, her eyes still downcast. "You didn't defeat me today." Arif looked at her gently. "I didn't come to." She nodded. "But you did something far greater. You made me see." A pause. "And I don't know what happens next." Arif smiled faintly. "That's the beauty of truth, Sister Clara. It doesn't demand certainty. Only sincerity." Clara's hands closed the Qur'an slowly. She held it to her chest, not like a scholar or a priestess, but like someone holding something precious for the very first time. Her black robe now stained with tears, her posture no longer upright with arrogance, but bowed with humility. The same hands that once tore pages, now cradled them. She stepped down from the altar slowly. Each step echoed with memory, with reflection, with change. She did not preach. She did not instruct. She simply walked toward Arif. She stood in front of him, eyes still wet. "Will you pray for me?" she asked. Arif nodded. "Every day." "And for them?" she added, glancing at the congregation. He followed her gaze. "Them too." In that moment, something sacred had passed between them, not religion, but humanity. Not conversion, but awakening. The congregation continued to rise. Some held each other. Others closed their eyes. And many stared at the young boy who had said little, but had said enough to make centuries of prejudice tremble and crack. Then, without another word, Arif picked up his empty bag, now light from the absence of books, and turned toward the door. The same door through which he had entered in silence, now became his exit, quiet, respectful, unchanged in his humility. As he walked past the pews, no one tried to stop him. But every eye followed him. Not like a celebrity. Not like a warrior. But like a traveler carrying something too vast for words. He stepped outside, into the soft light of the late afternoon. The street outside was still bustling. Cars passed. Birds flew. But inside the church, time had paused. Clara remained at the altar, her hands never letting go of the Qur'an. She didn't tell anyone to believe. She didn't preach. She just stood there, a symbol of something no one could ignore. And the congregation, once full of certainty, now full of questions, understood something deeper than words could say. That sometimes, all it takes is a whisper of truth in a house of noise to change everything. And on that quiet Sunday in downtown Chicago, in a place where hate once echoed, hope was born. Not through force. Not through fear. But through the truth. And the heart that dared to listen,